I had solved far bigger problems than this before. Real problems, not the kind that announce themselves ahead of time, the kind that creep in quietly and tear your life apart if you don't notice them early. Then I heard his voice. "This old man can't handle this." My son-in-law Gregory said it loud enough for nearly half the construction site to hear. He was standing right next to his boss, holding a blue clipboard, pointing at the project drawings spread across the hood of my pickup truck. His hard hat sat slightly crooked. He'd always been careless with details like that. The diesel engines went quiet. The hammering stopped. Even the cement mixer seemed to freeze halfway through a turn. I had driven out to the Riverside Medical Center expansion site on a Tuesday morning. I had one simple intention, to see how my daughter's husband was doing in his new role. A 5-minute visit. A quiet, proud father-in-law checking on family. Instead, I suddenly found myself being pushed aside like a confused old man who had wandered onto an active construction site by mistake. Something cold settled in the center of my chest. This wasn't just professional embarrassment, was it? Or was I reading too much into it? Gregory had seen me coming, and right there in that moment, he decided how to position me. "But why like this? Sir, you really shouldn't be standing here without safety gear," Gregory continued. His tone was carefully chosen, a familiar tone, the one men use when they want witnesses. "This is a complex commercial project, not really something everyone can understand." He let the sentence trail off, waved his hand toward me. My clothes, my graying hair, my age, without hesitation. I saw it in his eyes. That sense of relief, his boss watching him manage the difficult family member. This wasn't about safety. This was about looking professional in front of Mitchell, about showing Linda's father who was in control now. This was a performance, for Mitchell as much as it was against me. 3 hard hats turned in our direction. The cement mixer operator shut off the engine. 2 electricians dropped their cables and started watching. His boss walked over. A large man in his 50s, built like an oak trunk. You could tell he'd spent his life building things with his hands. "Is there a problem here, Greg?" he asked, looking between us. "No problem, Mr. Mitchell," Gregory said quickly. "Just my wife's father. He wanted to see the site, but you know how it is." He shrugged. The motion was a little too rehearsed. Older people, active construction zones. I could feel people staring. No one stepped in. No one said a word. They just watched. It left a sour taste in my mouth like spoiled milk. You know that taste, you drink it expecting something good, and instead your stomach turns and your mouth fills with bitterness that won't go away. Gregory made everything sound reasonable, professional, as if he were protecting me from myself, as if I were some senile old man who couldn't possibly understand how dangerous construction sites could be, when in reality those are exactly the places where people get hurt if they don't know what they're doing. Some of you know exactly what this moment feels like. Gregory continued his performance. Yes, his performance. "These engineering plans are pretty technical, Dad," he said. "They require specialized knowledge. You should probably head home. I'll tell Linda you stopped by." The condescension in his voice cut like a saw, but that wasn't what bothered me most. It was the lie. Yes, the lie. I hadn't come here as a tourist who needed protection. For 3 weeks, Gregory had been calling Linda every night, complaining about problems in the structural engineering plans, problems that kept him awake. Problems that could cost him his job, problems he had asked me to look at, but now, standing there among workers, machines, and judging eyes, he was acting as if those conversations had never happened. Maybe he thought this would impress Linda. Maybe he wanted to show his wife that he could handle her father professionally. Or maybe, and this was the part that hurt the most, he truly believed I couldn't help. I stood there for 37 minutes while Gregory explained to his boss why the medical center's foundation was giving him headaches and how the consulting engineer's calculations didn't make sense. 37 minutes of listening to him describe problems I'd already offered to help solve. The morning sun was getting warmer, and I could feel sweat starting under my collar. I didn't speak. I listened to every word, noted every technical detail, cataloged every assumption he was making about load-bearing requirements and soil compaction ratios. I didn't react. I remembered everything. The irony sat heavy in my chest. Here was my son-in-law, complaining about engineering challenges to his boss, while the man who could help him stood 10 feet away being treated like a liability. But maybe Gregory was right to be cautious. Maybe I was being too sensitive about this. Maybe a retired guy in street clothes really didn't belong on an active construction site. Maybe I was overstepping, reading too much into a simple safety concern. For a moment I doubted myself. Still, something felt wrong about the way he'd dismissed me. Not just professionally wrong, but personally wrong, like he was ashamed to have me associated with his work in any way. Or maybe that was just my pride talking. I watched Gregory point at different sections of the blueprints, his confidence wavering when his boss asked specific questions about foundation depth and concrete specifications. Questions that had simple answers if you understood the engineering principles involved. questions I could have answered in my sleep. The problem, Gregory said, running his finger along the foundation diagram, is these calculations for the south wall. The engineer wants 18-inch footings, but that seems like overkill for a single-story medical wing. His boss, Mitchell, leaned closer to examine the plans. 18 inches? That does sound heavy. What's the soil analysis say? Clay base with variable density, but I think we could get away with 12 inches and save the client some money, maybe even 10 if we really wanted to push it. I watched this conversation with growing concern, not because Gregory was wrong, though he was, but because of what his mistake could cost. My coffee was getting cold in the truck, but I couldn't move away from this. Gregory was looking at the wrong section of the blueprints. The south wall wasn't supporting a single-story medical wing. It was supporting the foundation for a future 4-story parking structure that wouldn't be built for 2 years. At the time, it felt harmless, just a misunderstanding about project phases. Gregory was new to commercial construction, coming from residential work. Multi-phase projects were more complex than single-family homes. Anyone could make that mistake, right? I'd made similar errors early in my career, but the engineering calculations weren't wrong. They were exactly right for the load they'd eventually need to carry. If Gregory convinced his boss to cut those footings from 18 inches to 12, they'd have to tear up the foundation and start over when the parking structure phase began. The client would lose millions. Mitchell's company would lose the contract. And Gregory would lose more than his job. He'd lose more than his job. You know what? Gregory said, straightening up from the plans and rubbing his neck. I should probably get a second opinion on these calculations. Someone independent. Mitchell nodded approvingly. Good thinking. Better to double-check now than deal with problems later. You got someone in mind? Actually, yeah. There's this consulting firm downtown. They specialize in foundation analysis for commercial projects. I knew Gregory didn't have money for outside consultants. His budget was tight, and Linda had mentioned they were behind on their mortgage. A consulting engineer would cost thousands they didn't have. But what caught my attention was something smaller. Gregory's safety clipboard was missing the soil analysis report. In commercial construction, the soil analysis report never leaves the site supervisor's hands. It contains critical information about ground conditions that affect every decision. Experienced supervisors guard those reports like sacred documents. Gregory's clipboard had blueprints, contractor schedules, and material specifications, but no soil analysis. If you know, you know. I also noticed something else. When Mitchell asked about the foundation depth, Gregory had glanced quickly toward the trailer that served as the site office, not at the blueprints in front of him, but toward the trailer, like he was checking to make sure something was still there, or making sure someone wasn't listening. Mitchell was explaining the timeline for the foundation pour when I noticed the date stamp on the blueprints. The plans Gregory was using were marked Revision 3 March 15th, but sitting in my truck I could see another set of blueprints in the site office window. The date stamp on those plans read Revision 5 DOP in April 8th. Gregory was making decisions based on plans that were 3 weeks out of date. That single detail changed everything, because now I understood what was happening. Gregory wasn't just confused about the project phases. He was working from obsolete information that didn't include the parking structure addition or the soil analysis updates. The real plans, the current plans, were sitting in the office window where everyone could see them except the site supervisor who needed them most. Either Gregory hadn't bothered to get the updated plans, or someone hadn't bothered to give them to him. Either way, he was about to make a decision that would haunt this project for years, and everyone would assume it was his fault. I didn't say anything that morning, told Gregory I was just visiting and would let him get back to work. He seemed relieved to see me go. But instead of driving home, I pulled into the parking lot across the street and made 3 phone calls. The first was to my daughter, Linda. "Dad, what's wrong?" she said when she heard my voice. "Nothing's wrong. I just need to ask you something. Has Gregory mentioned any problems with the foundation engineering at his site? Every night for 3 weeks, he's worried the engineer made mistakes. Why? Has he said anything about getting the updated blueprints?" Long pause. "Updated blueprints? Dad, what are you talking about?" I explained what I'd seen. The different revision dates, the missing soil analysis, the confusion about project phases. Linda listened without interrupting. "So Gregory's been working from the wrong plans this whole time? It looks that way. And if he convinces his boss to cut those footings, they'll have to redo the entire foundation when they build the parking garage. Dad, that would ruin him. Mitchell's company would lose millions." I know. The second call was to Janet Morrison, a structural engineer I'd worked with for 20 years before retiring. Janet specialized in commercial foundations and had consulted on projects 3 times the size of the medical center. "Janet, hypothetical question. If someone started pouring 18-inch footings for a south wall, then discovered they needed to support a future 4-story structure, what would you do?" 18 inches should handle a 4-story load depending on soil conditions. Why? And if they cut it to 12 inches instead? Frank, they'd have to tear out the entire foundation and start over. We're talking about millions in overruns. Please tell me this is actually hypothetical. I'm not sure yet. The third call was to the Riverside County Building Department. I needed to verify what I suspected about the project phases and the parking structure timeline. Building Permits Department, this is Carol. Hi Carol, this is Frank Weber. I'm reviewing some specifications for the Riverside Medical Center expansion. Can you confirm the phases for that project? Let me pull that up. Weber, aren't you retired now? I am. This is a family consultation. Okay, Riverside Medical. Phase 1 is the single-story medical wing. Foundation pour scheduled for this month. Phase 2 is a 4-story parking structure, scheduled to begin construction in 18 months. And the foundation specifications call for integrated footings to support both structures? That's correct. The engineering firm designed the Phase 1 foundation to handle the eventual load from the parking garage. Standard practice for phased commercial projects. Quiet people prepare louder than they speak. I'd spent 43 years as a structural engineer, 30 of them specializing in commercial foundations. I'd seen soil reports that Gregory couldn't interpret. I'd reviewed engineering calculations that went over his head. I'd managed multi-phase projects that he'd never even heard of. I knew exactly what those updated blueprints contained. I knew why the footings needed to be 18 inches. And I knew what would happen if Gregory convinced his boss to cut corners based on outdated information. But what Gregory didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd lived through foundation failures and structural collapses. I'd seen what happened when someone made decisions based on fear instead of facts. I knew the difference between genuine engineering concerns and uninformed panic. He wasn't identifying real problems. He was creating them. And tomorrow, I was going to stop him before those problems became disasters. Gregory called Linda 4 times in 2 days. Each call was more frustrated than the last. More pressure to figure out the foundation problem before his boss lost confidence in him. He says the engineer won't return his calls, Linda told me after the 3rd conversation. He's thinking about hiring that consultant, even if it costs us the emergency fund. What consultant? Some firm downtown. They specialize in foundation analysis. I knew Gregory didn't have money for outside consultants, but desperation makes people do expensive things. The 4th call came on Friday evening while Linda and I were having dinner. She answered on speakerphone without thinking. Honey, I can't figure this out. Gregory's voice filled our kitchen. Mitchell wants an answer by Monday morning. Either we stick with the engineer's plans, or we change the footings and save the client money. What does the engineer say? Linda asked. He won't call me back. I left 6 messages this week. That's when I knew Gregory was in deeper trouble than he realized. Consulting engineers always return calls from site supervisors. Always. If the engineer wasn't calling back, there was a reason. And I had a good idea what that reason was. I sat in my study that night, looking through 43 years of structural engineering files, foundation specifications for hospitals, schools, and office buildings, soil analysis reports from projects that had succeeded and projects that had failed, all of it built on the principle that you never guess about foundations. You calculate, you verify, and you follow the plans. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was my son-in-law, facing an engineering problem that I'd solved hundreds of times in my career, but he'd rather hire expensive consultants than ask for my help. But this wasn't really about engineering, was it? This was about respect, about a young man who couldn't see knowledge in anything that didn't come with a hard hat and work boots, about expertise being dismissed because it came from someone too old to understand modern construction. I thought about Linda, about the emergency fund Gregory was about to waste on unnecessary consulting fees, about the mortgage payments that would become impossible if he lost his job over this foundation mistake. But some principles matter more than family harmony. Some mistakes have consequences that last longer than hurt feelings. I'd been a structural engineer since before Gregory was born. I'd designed foundations that were still standing after 30 years. I'd prevented disasters that no one would ever know about because prevention doesn't make headlines. And tomorrow I was going to prevent another one. Monday morning I arrived at the construction site at 7 a.m. Mitchell was there early, reviewing the weekend's progress with his foreman. Gregory was at the foundation forms, clipboard in hand, looking like a man facing an impossible decision. I walked directly to Mitchell. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm Frank Weber, Gregory's father-in-law. Could I have a word with you about the foundation specifications?" Mitchell looked confused. "About the what?" "The foundation specifications for the south wall. Gregory's been concerned about the 18-inch footings." "Yeah, he mentioned that. Says the engineer might be overbuilding." Mitchell glanced toward Gregory, who was walking over quickly. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Gregory's voice carried a note of panic. "I'm here to prevent you from making a very expensive mistake. I pulled a folder from my truck and handed it to Mitchell. Inside were copies of the current blueprints, revision 5, along with the soil analysis report and a simple chart showing load calculations for the future parking structure. Gregory's been working from outdated plans, I said calmly. The current specifications include a 4-story parking garage that won't be built until Phase 2. The 18-inch footings aren't overbuilding. They're exactly what you need. Mitchell studied the documents while Gregory stood frozen beside us. You forgot what I used to do for a living, I said, looking directly at Gregory. I was a structural engineer for 43 years. Commercial foundations were my specialty. I retired as senior partner at Weber & Associates. Mitchell's head snapped up. Weber & Associates, you designed the foundation for the new courthouse downtown, among other things. Gregory's face went pale. Mitchell turned to Gregory, his voice dropping to a level that made nearby workers stop what they were doing. Greg, next time, before you embarrass yourself like this, make sure the person you dismiss isn't the most qualified one on the site. A silence settled over the construction site. No one laughed. No one spoke. Gregory stared at the blueprints like they'd betrayed him. You forgot who you were talking to, I continued. The old man you didn't think could handle your technical problems. I've designed foundations for buildings 10 times larger than this medical center. The truth was simpler than Gregory had imagined, and more embarrassing than he'd feared. Mitchell spent 20 minutes reviewing the documents I'd brought. The updated blueprints, the soil analysis, the load calculations for the parking structure. Gregory stood beside us in silence, his face growing paler as the scope of his mistake became clear. Greg, Mitchell said finally, where did you get the plans you've been using? The site office. They've been there since I started. These are the wrong plans. The current specs are completely different. Mitchell held up both sets of blueprints side by side. You've been working from the preliminary design, not the final engineering. Look at the dates. I didn't know, Gregory said quietly. That's a pretty big thing not to know, Mitchell replied. But his tone wasn't angry. It was educational. Frank, I owe you a serious thank you. If we'd cut those footings to 12 inches, we'd be looking at a complete foundation replacement in 2 years. The client would sue us into bankruptcy. I watched Gregory process what that meant, not just for the project, but for his career, for his family's financial future, for the reputation he was trying to build in commercial construction. How long have you been doing structural engineering, Frank? Mitchell asked. 43 years. Retired 3 years ago from Weber & Associates. Mitchell's expression changed. Weber & Associates designed half the commercial buildings in this county, the courthouse, the new hospital, the tech center, among others. And Gregory here was worried you couldn't handle looking at his foundation plans? Mitchell shook his head. Son, do you realize who you've been talking to? Gregory didn't lose his job that day. That would have been easier. What he lost was something harder to recover, credibility. From that morning on, people double-checked his decisions. Questions followed him longer than answers, and whenever blueprints were laid out on a table, someone always asked, did Frank see this yet? The engineer hadn't been ignoring Gregory's calls, it turned out. He'd been calling the wrong number, an old contact from the preliminary phase. When Gregory finally reached him with the current information, their conversation lasted 5 minutes. The footings are calculated for the full load of both project phases, the engineer explained. If you'd cut them to 12 inches, we'd have been liable for a complete foundation replacement. Today, Gregory still works for Mitchell's company. He's been promoted twice and now manages commercial projects across 3 counties. He calls me when he runs into engineering problems he doesn't understand, and he introduces me to his crews as Frank, the engineer who taught me how to read blueprints properly. Experience doesn't announce itself, Mitchell said to me that day. After Gregory had walked away, it waits, because the truth about people like Gregory is simple. They're not stupid, they're just inexperienced. And experience isn't something you can buy from consultants or learn from YouTube videos. Experience comes from making mistakes and learning from them, or from having someone around who's already made those mistakes for you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Justice doesn't shout. It just waits. Some of us are older, but we're not blind.